Hi, everybody. Welcome to week number 2 of our Bible study for Southeast Online called From Exodus to Easter. We're looking at how the story from the book of Exodus, the story of the Exodus of God's people, is really a story we can all connect with, and it really does point us to Jesus consistently. It points us to the resurrection. It points us to Easter, and so we love getting to be able to do that. This week, we're talking all about the beginning and origin story of Moses. I learned some things in this conversation, and so I hope you do as well. Joining me today are Terrence and Chad Mosteller. They're two of our pastors on staff. They work primarily in our city region of Louisville, and some good things happening with them, but they're also super knowledgeable, and they bring up things that I've never thought about before. So be challenged in this conversation. Hop in, join in. It's week number 2 of our Bible study. So week 2 of Exodus to Easter, last week, all right, to get you two caught up. Last week, we were doing the story of Joseph, right? And he leads us into, crazy story, into the land of Egypt. And so his family enters in with 70 people, right? Enters in with 70 people, and a nation is formed, and so many things kind of happen over the next 400 years in which they are given the land of Goshen to settle in, and Pharaoh takes notice of this, and a nation is growing. He gets pretty insecure about that. Pharaoh does, about this nation forming. So when you think about that early narrative, I'll let you guys, one of you just grab it, talk to us through what happens during those 400 years and kind of Pharaoh's response to it.
In these first few verses, we get to see a paradigm of how fear of man, or what man could do, versus fear of God can do. We see those things play against each other, where Pharaoh has a fear of man. He has a fear of losing something that is near and dear to him, maybe his kingdom. And then we see these women who have a fear of God, and they can't follow through with what the lesser God, per se, is telling them to do. And so we see God reward them for their fear, their honor of him. And so I think that's just something that we all can just tuck away in our hearts, as that is very relevant to today. There are always going to be times where we have to face the fear of man versus the fear of God.
I think that's a good parallel, because I think that's still true today. I think in many ways I am more present focused, right? So the judgment of God seems something so far off. I don't fear it as presently as the fear of man and what can happen. I want to hoard what limited things I do have. And so, it is very, very fascinating. The other thing I find interesting within all this is actually Pharaoh orders the boys born to be thrown into the Nile. And I like this imagery we talked about yesterday with the story of Joseph, last week with the story of Joseph. I like this imagery that keeps showing up again and again, which is the place of death that's meant for harm is used for good. Joseph even says that, right? What you intended for harm, God used for good. And we're seeing this play out again as well, kind of within this imagery, is that the place, the Nile, that is intended for the death of the boys, out of that waters is going to rise life, because God has someone that he's raising up in there. And there's an interesting story with the story of Moses, where he's born in this time. And so, Chad, I don't know if you can take us in. So Moses is born in this time, and take us into that a little bit. When he's born, how do they respond?
Yeah, what's interesting, you mentioned, I like that, like what is intended for death, life comes, from this. The word for basket there is the same word where we get the ark, and so you just see this theme, throughout. Reminds us of Genesis 6 with Noah, and and some of this. And so God continues to preserve life in the midst of, really a culture of death here from what Pharaoh has issued. The abandoned son motif is pretty common, among what's interesting is it's not the abandoned son that becomes the hero, but Yahweh himself, God of Israel, becomes the hero in the story. And so that's kind of when Moses steps onto the scene, really. He's saved, literally saved, and makes his way downriver to, of all the people, Pharaoh's daughter.
Yeah, so that's what's we're just to get the detail. And, we're going to be reading this in our Bible reading plan within all this, but, Moses uh, is born into the world. And when his mom could hide him no longer, she decides to place him in this basket, which is the word ark, which I find fascinating. Again, that kind of harkens back to Noah's ark in the water, the place of death and the place of life kind of coming together.
Yeah.
She sends him down the river, and Pharaoh's daughter finds the Israelite boy that she knows should not be there, and she raises him as her own. And it's just such a fascinating tale of how God, from a place of death, can bring redemption. And so Moses is now raised up as an Egyptian in a home of the people of power of Egypt. I want to pause on this because I think people can read this and we can understand this. There's an amazing parallel that's prophetic, is that out of Egypt our own Savior will come. And what's fascinating when Chad, I'll let you share that a little bit. How does this parallel the story of Jesus?
Yeah, I mean, well, just what you said. I mean, out of Egypt, we see these prophecies. I think about, I didn't look at this before, but I think of Matthew, where they go to Egypt, and so we kind of see this running back to Egypt. They're trying to get out of Egypt.
Yeah.
I mean, Egypt is kind of this new Babylon, if you will, and so. Yeah, I think Jesus, certainly we see this theme throughout, but, out of Egypt, the Savior comes. We get a glimpse at this at Moses.
Yeah.
Of course, Moses doesn't know that, right?
No.
But this is a beautiful thing about the Scripture. We get to look back kind of through the eyes of Jesus a little bit,
Yeah.
to this story.
Yeah, it's interesting too. They're both, Jesus and Moses, raised in that same climate, educated by the same ones.
Yeah.
And then from that, that's, where salvation comes. And that's the story of Exodus within all this as well, is that I think that's out of that as well. And so, Moses enters the scene in this section. And he's got kind of an interesting, the first 40 years of his life, Moses' life is 40, 40, 40. You can kind of section it off, right? So the first 40 years, he's raised in Egypt in the household, of Pharaoh in power and, presumably well-educated and well-connected, well-powerful and all that. But then he starts to take notice that he knows he's not Egyptian, right? He starts noticing his people, and he notices their oppression. And his response to it is, when he sees them mistreated, is he ends up killing an Egyptian, thinking it's unnoticed. And then the next day he realizes, no, it's been noticed, and he fears for his life. And again, you see the insecure response, Terrence, of Pharaoh, where he then wants to eliminate Moses. And so he flees off to Midian, and he leaves the area for 40 years, and he lives in isolation now, away, fearing for his life. But I want to circle back onto kind of the response of God during this time in the Israelites' time with that, is God did not just unnotice them. Like, it wasn't that he wasn't noticing what was happening. How do you hear and read about 400 years of slavery and oppression? How do you bring that context to life today, Terrence? When you hear about this, how does this part of the story matter to us today?
Yeah, I mean, I think number one, if we just want to go straight to where our hope should be, it's a reminder that we should never place our hope into life here.
Mm-hmm.
That calamity, things like slavery, things like injustice, will perpetually exist until Christ comes back and redeems us. And that's the story of Exodus in a bigger framework, is that there's this redemptive salvation that happens. And so, we see this in a way as just like an invitation for us to hope for our salvation.
Yeah.
Particularly, just me as a black man, growing up in predominantly black churches, we oftentimes treaded through the waters of Exodus as a congregation, as a means of hope. We found a lot of similarities with ourselves just in the American experience of black folks, and just saying, like, man, there's a hope, and that hope can be found in Jesus, and we see that displayed beautifully through the story. So it's just a promise for me, a promise kept, that like God always sees us. He always shows up right on time. There was always the saying growing up, he may not come when you want him, but he'll be there right on time. He's an on-time God.
Yeah.
Yes, he is. And he was an on-time God for the Israelites in this season. And it showed. I was reading up on this particular part of the story where the tide changes, and some commentators believe that, God operates in cycles. And so there was a fullness of time that needed to take place before he stepped into the story. And maybe that fullness of time was for Moses to rise up and become an adult and then go out and have that season of maturity and then to be brought back into the fold. I'm not sure. I don't want to speculate on that. But
Yeah.
in the fullness of time, God showed up and he put his eyes. Well, he never took his eyes off of people, but he began to interact with them in a more intentional way as we read as the story transitions to chapter 2.
Well, and I think too, you make a great point, which is a lot of times I want God to redeem situations, but what I really mean is I want him to do it when I want him to do it, which is usually right now.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the timing of God, we don't always get to understand how that's going to operate. But there's generations of people in these 400 years that all they knew was the oppression. And it really seems that in the last bit, it was ramping up. I described it as a sliding scale as Joseph became a more distant memory of them, and how this came to be, this arrangement in Goshen with the Egyptians. As that became harder to see, I think it became easier to be threatened by them as they really formed a larger nation within that. And then I think the story, as Pharaoh's getting really nervous and he's wanting to kill the boys and do all these things, and then he's chasing down. I got to think when Moses, when he's chasing him away, I got to think the level of oppression at the end probably hit a fever pitch, because there's just seems to be a lot of threat coming in. And those last 40 years when Moses is in Midian, again, I'm reading into this, I would assume probably are some of the worst years.
Yeah.
Would you disagree or agree with that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's all the things you want to, to Terrence's point, you don't want to speculate, on too many things, but we have to understand, like, it's his mother that Pharaoh's daughter says, go and have this Hebrew woman nurse him. So I can't imagine what that must have been like, for this mother to come into Pharaoh's home, not only to watch him go down, stream in the basket, but then I think being, as a young man being raised in this home, you certainly are not this people. And you're in someone else's home, and you're in someone else's home that you start to look around, and this person is oppressing the people that do look like you.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that's like. I can attach a little bit, identify a little bit to the abandonment piece of it, what that must have felt like. But there is a sense of, like, where they're Hebrew boys growing up with Moses and saying, you're a traitor. You're a traitor, you're a sellout, whatever it may be. And this is his time to, like, defend his people, but really defend his name too, a little bit. So, I don't know. It's just a thought.
Is there something you're thinking of over there?
Oh no, I was just reflecting on just the narrative there, and I think there's something too also as the story transitions when it says that God finally hears them, right? When their groaning finally reaches God, not to speculate, but I just wonder, like, after so many years of prosperity in Egypt, I wonder was there just like this sense of like we owe it to them to do some of these things they're asking us to do, and it took Pharaoh increasing the amount of discomfort for them to remove their allegiance from Egypt, and to seek allegiance somewhere else, because Egypt was a sanctuary. It was a resting place.
Yeah, it began as a positive thing and became negative, and I think it's an interesting point that God. I'd never thought about that. Maybe they were getting too comfortable in the land that wasn't theirs. It wasn't the place that God had promised His people. It was a temporary sanctuary in the time of a drought, right? And they provided refuge for them. And maybe God, and I think, honestly, if I spin that forward, Terrence, that's a great idea. And I think about my life, I think so much so when that's the power of the place of death is the place of life. God uses the most uncomfortable of circumstances, I think, to do the biggest work in us. I really do. Like, when I think of my narrative, if I were to, draw the story of my life in arc form, it's the low points that probably are the most significant in terms of my personal gain or growth. And I look at some of those moments and I think to myself, well, I wouldn't want to do that. I wouldn't choose that. But I can't imagine not having those moments.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of makes you, who you are. Like, I mean, I think back to, and Terrence and I have talked a lot about this, but I think back to my biological father leaving when I was a kid,
Mhm.
and just, man, I would never wish that.
Mhm.
And now having kids, I watch that among my, like, man, they're not gonna have to go through what I went through, but at the same time, God has used
They're not
that
gonna have that
to
benefit. I hate putting
deepen.
that word there.
Yeah,
It's not a benefit, but it is.
yeah,
And
it's like, I don't know, God has a way of using that, and I think you brought it back to Jesus earlier, like, Jesus and his family go to Egypt as a place of respite, as a
yep.
place of retreat,
Yep.
to get away from a really angry man,
A
So
very similar situation, very
yeah,
insecure, crazy
yeah,
ruler, ready to kill all the
killing
boys.
every boy,
Yeah, it's the
all the
same
boys
story.
under two. I mean, it just all this
Yeah.
narrative repeats itself, and really for Pharaoh, I think one of the big things that we see repeated from Genesis is Pharaoh gets to discern, gets to distinguish between what is good and
Hmm.
evil. Like he gets to say, you know what, this is a good thing that we kill these boys and do this, and that just that leads to so much devastation, and
Hmm.
it ends up falling on the person, and in this case, Pharaoh,
Yeah.
himself.
Yeah, I do think that the power of seeing that that's still true today, and Terrence, I appreciate bringing that up. The discomfort that God sometimes I think uses in our story is super powerful within that. And I know for me, you know, I see that in my own story where we were married 3 or 4 months. My wife diagnosed with cancer, and still to this day we're still dealing with that. Whatever it's been, 15, 16 years later, it's still a part of our story. But without that, I wouldn't be who I am. And I have a friend that grew up, I guess poor is the only word I can use, and grew up where money was tight. Like if he was going to get a pair of shoes or whatever as a kid, he knew it was on him to mow the
Yeah,
lawns. Mom and dad were going to give him one pair of shoes a year.
yeah,
Whether they fit or not by the end of the year didn't matter. He would get him one. And I was joking with him because he's done a lot better for himself
yeah,
and his family. And that's part of his ethic and all that. And I go, your kids don't have the same work ethic as you do. And he's like,
yeah,
no, they don't have a clue.
yeah,
Well, it's because of that childhood.
yeah.
And it's the place that the thing that was the hardest, having that hard moment is what makes it. Well, back to the story, Exodus 2, verse 24. Terrence, you brought this up about how God's response to their moaning. I think that's such a good thing. It says, and God heard their moaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw the Israelites, and God knew. And I think that's such a powerful way of maybe saying biblical compassion on people is that you hear them, you remember them, you see them, and you know them. And I think that's like a powerful narrative is that God is not lost. It's not lost on God what their problem is. And he's saying, in due time, I'm going to do that. But if I spin that to like kind of the gospel centered of like, what's that mean for us to today? I love some of the content of this is that realization of that's still true today, except sometimes I think today people don't realize they're enslaved presently in their current situations until it gets really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Like you don't realize that you are entrapped in a certain situation. So when you think through that lens, why do we not think of sin as oppressive
Mm.
and enslaving us? Why do we think of it as freeing? Like what's happening there, Terrence, with that? Because I think most people think freedom is sin, like that is freeing when really it's oppressing.
I would say, now, outside of the church community, right? People don't identify their lifestyle as sin.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, so I would say like they're just doing what naturally feels right to them, and we don't want to be extra churchy and say that like the things of the world don't provide some form of pleasure. It's just that pleasure runs out, and there's nothing to cling to.
Well, and it traps you.
Yeah, it can entrap you. You can get into a cycle,
Mhm.
and so that doesn't necessarily feel oppressive. It just in some ways becomes a challenge of how do I recreate that moment,
Mhm.
right? And so I think that's part of the reason, right? Even when you read through Jesus' interaction with the Pharisees and the Jewish community of that time. He referenced to them being enslaved, and they said, "Man, we're nobody's slave. What are you talking about? We've never been enslaved." And like it was like they totally forgot about their whole lineage, but also their Roman occupation
Yeah.
at the time is right. So like we don't like to see ourselves in that light, and so I just think there's something to this idea of Paul using the language of being enslaved to sin because he wanted to paint the picture of how deeply rooted and how deep under control we are
Hmm.
of this thing, and it's not just a desire, but it wants to take your life. It wants to get something from you, right? And so I think that's helpful. And so when you think about this story, right, they were enslaved, and Pharaoh wanted to get something from them, right? He wanted them to build something. They needed to produce something, right? But ultimately, he wanted to kill them,
Yeah.
right? And so that's what sin always wants to do at the end as well for us, is kill us.
I think of that old adage, you can take the people out of Egypt, but you can't take the Egypt out of people.
There you go.
I mean, it's that whole thing. First thing they want to do is go back. I know
Yeah.
we're getting ahead,
Yeah.
but that's what we see.
Hmm.
I
And you see that in the narrative of people's story for redemption. First
Yeah.
thing they want to do after they get kind of healthy with a certain situation is go back.
Yeah. One of the things I was thinking is Terrence talked, and we've talked about this before, but we don't really have, and I'm going to speak to the church here, we don't really have a solid theology of perseverance, of endurance, and so,
In today's context. You mean?
yeah, today's context, like we want things now, we want it
Mhm.
our way, and more immediate. And I think what we see, going back to your very first question, around the 400 years, is we see this kind of perseverance. Moses, I think, in some way, had to think about his mother at some point, and would not remember, but maybe. I mean, and so you think about that kind of perseverance. He's in somebody's home, and not just any home. Like, let's be honest. Like,
Mhm.
he's growing up in Pharaoh's home.
Yeah, he's growing up.
If
in
there
wealth.
was ever an opportunity to feel entitled,
Mhm.
was this dude.
Yeah.
And so, but I think about that perseverance. I think about like a Harriet Tubman, like literally seeing herself as a Moses, leading the people out on the Underground Railroad, and you think about that kind of perseverance, and it reached a point to where she said, I got to do this.
Right.
Like, I got to do this. And I don't know if Terrence wants to add
Well-
anything to that.
Well, I just think that her story and many of the other stories are stories of not forgetting the God of Israel.
Yeah.
Right. I think one of the things that coincided with this story is, like, just as the Pharaoh didn't know about Joseph, as you read the story, you realize that the Israelites had forgotten about the God of Joseph,
Mhm.
because when Moses shows up, he has to tell them who this God is. Right. And so commentators are saying, like, they just started crying out to a God. They didn't even know what God they were praying to. They just, because that somewhere there was a lack of faithfulness on the generations to continue to tell the story of how God used Joseph to save a nation.
Yeah.
And so as the story continues, right, we see this,
Yeah.
even as they go and wander, and they just have to keep being reminded of God's faithfulness. So I think there's just this just story that just runs beside each other that we can't miss either. And so part of that perseverance is us remembering God, remembering where he has brought us. And this is why Paul's language is so strong on the resurrection, right? He oftentimes talked about the resurrection because we've been talking about it. You go to the place of death to bring life.
Yeah.
Always remember the resurrection. Don't ever let anybody talk you out of the resurrection, because
Yeah.
if they talk you out of the resurrection,
There's
they
nothing
can
left.
they can talk you out of
Yeah.
everything else that you've come to love and believe. And so I just think that was an important piece that I thought
Yeah, I
of.
think that's important to realize, is that they didn't know the God of their fathers anymore. They
Right.
they had to kind of abandon that. And again, when we get to the place of discomfort, I think God ultimately really does redeem and utilize those moments for good. And it's so hard and painful, and we're all going to experience life in that way.
Right.
But I think if we embrace it and go, "What is God teaching me in this moment?" I think on the other side, there'll be another time. It's the joke of, don't pray for patience, because God will teach you patience through experience.
Yeah.
But I think on a life scale thing, there's so much truth to that in other contexts as well, as that's what's used. So Moses, getting back to our story here, Moses flees at 40 years old. He grows up for the first 40 there because he kills an Egyptian when he encounters the injustice. Flees because Pharaoh's starting to turn. He leaves for 40 years, gets married, moves out to Midian, which we were debating on where it is, but it's far away. As Chad said earlier, he said it's a hop, skip, and a jump.
Yeah.
So I think that's in the Bible. And so he's there for 40 years, and then God shows up. There's the account about the burning bush. I mean, I could spend a whole nother time on that. You guys will be reading that. But so many things happen. But what I wanted to zero in on our conversation with is, and it's used a lot, but is the calling of Moses is just so interesting. So um, uh, he gives a lot of reasons to not, right? So God's pointing him to be the messenger to respond to redeem the Israelites.
Yeah.
And I find all his responses to God very funny in the bush. He's first things he says is, "Who am I?" So, and, God lets him know that. And then he said, "Well, what's your name? Because if I go there, they're going to want to know what your name." And then God gives a very interesting answer. You could talk a long time about that. And he goes, "By what power do I have this? And what if they don't listen to me?" And he says, "I can't speak. You should probably send someone else." Like, he keeps kind of running through this narrative over and over and over again. When you read about his response and his timidity to engage in this, what do you think of as a pastor? How does that apply to us today when you watch how Moses' response is extreme resistance to taking this on? Why do you think that is, and where do you see the importance of us today on that?
Well, my immediate answer is a little bit of what Terrence said in terms of they forgot.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Moses knew God. And that may blow some
Wow.
folks' minds, but
So you're saying, like, at
as
this
you
moment,
read,
you're wondering.
I don't think, and I think Exodus 4 will show clearly
Mhm.
that Moses did not know Yahweh, this God. And so, but it is interesting to me, and I don't want to get in the weeds here, but we've often taken his father-in-law, Jethro. Jethro is his name. Jethro is really not his name. It's more a title of posterity. But he's a priest of Midian. Like, this dude, like, literally the name is Raul, which means friend of God. And so I've wondered in my own study, it's like, man, was this the guy, the father-in-law, that ends up teaching Moses what it means to be a friend of Yahweh, what it means to be a friend of God? But we're going to see. I don't think Moses knows God. In fact, strictly my opinion, but I don't think he knows God until about Exodus 19, where he's like, "Oh, this is the God of, this is the God of my fathers. This is, and so." But with all that said, I think Moses was just, I think he's 80 now, and which says something to those listening, like, your best years are still ahead of you,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so, and this is going to be the richest part of his life
Yeah.
in many ways. And I think there's something to be said there.
So let's assume you're correct. At the very least, Moses is pretty distant with God.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting again how many times God uses that person as his messenger. Obviously, we talked about this last time in one of these studies, but Saul became Paul, very similar, far from God actually,
Yeah.
in a different context with it. But God goes, "No, this is my chosen instrument," and I do find that interesting as that parallel comes again. Maybe it's an unexpected source.
Well, and yet, and let's be clear, Saul knew Yahweh God. He did not know what to do with this Jesus.
Correct. Well, and yes, I should say that. Yes, he knew God, but
Yeah.
he was not, he was the opposite of what you would have thought at the time, is what
Yeah.
I'm trying to say.
I think for a Moses, we have to remember, like, he's growing up in Pharaoh's home who thinks that he is God. And not only God, but he's worshiping a lot of gods. I mean,
Yeah.
anything you can put your eyes on was a god
Mhm.
in Egypt. So 40 years of
It's confusing.
40 years of
Yeah.
that, I mean, you have been literally indoctrinated. This is all you know.
Yeah.
And so now,
I think we missed that in the story. Isn't that really easy to think, yeah, he grew up in this household, but that realization of how much was handed down for 40 years of just this, the Egyptian gods were
Yeah.
handed to him and how much that was part of his daily life.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. I mean, I'm sitting at 44 and I think, if 40 years of my life was in a home
Right.
that I had everything at my fingertips,
Yeah.
and more importantly, Yahweh is never mentioned,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I mean, up until this point, the God of the Bible, Yahweh, is operating very much on a familial level,
Mm-hmm.
right? He came to Abraham, and so he worked through that lineage. And so, what Chad is saying, I think that's probably very accurate. If the nation that still did life together had forgotten about him. Then the kid that didn't even get a chance to really embrace that
Yeah.
nation, he just connected to them from an ethnic standpoint. And I think even in that story, we see the power of ethnic identity and how that can be a powerful force for us, and how God sends people can use that relatability as a lens and to go fishing for people, right? And so that's another story for another day. But when I think about this, I always laugh about this story because everybody gives Moses a hard time. But then when I was first got into ministry, like this was like the quintessential story of like people who respond to God like this are the preachers you need to invite to preach.
Yeah.
If anybody's really eager to stand up and preach, if they don't have a fear of God
Yeah.
to go and speak and proclaim God, those aren't the
Fair
people
enough.
you want.
Yeah.
And so, like, I always embrace this story very differently as just Moses really taking a humble posture and a unsure posture, understanding like, am I a fugitive? Am I even welcome back?
Yeah.
The one time that I tried to stand up for my people, they laughed at my face and exposed my fear.
Well, exposed, yeah, like a sinful reaction even for
Right.
him. Yeah.
And so and I'm thinking, man, he has a wife, he has a kid, like he has a good life. And like how hard is it for us to leave a good life sometimes, right?
Yeah.
When God comes and tells us it's time to go and do something else. So I see Moses in this moment being very human. I see him being very relatable. If I had a speech impediment and if I was 80 years old and you're telling me to move again and go do something new that could possibly get me killed, yeah, I think I would probably be like, you sure?
Yeah.
You sure you don't want to send old Chad to go?
Well, I think there's two things you guys.
pushing 90 at that point.
Yeah, I think there's two things you guys are pointing out on that I find interesting. One, I don't think all of us think of this time of the burning bush as being Moses really encountering God maybe for the first authentic time. Like I think that's such an interesting angle to think through of going. Not only is it the calling of it, but it could be also, I don't want to say the introduction, but like the most meaningful introduction, unless maybe Jethro was that already and kind of had prepared the way for him or whatever we may. But I think that helps us see it with fresh eyes. But I think to Terrence's point, the person you want leading you needs to have a right understanding of who God is and should have a little bit of fear of that, because if that's not there, if that tension's not there, that's probably scarier place to be to go, oh, I do belong in this spot. As we push into this, guys, because this is going to set up, there's a lot of wonders that happen to Moses in chapter 4. And God has to prove who he is kind of over and over again with the staff and different things, and they're going to read about. But as we push into this, and you all know where this story is going next, the 10 plagues and the Exodus are going on, and that's about to happen. What do you see right here happening as we close out our time with Moses as something that's important for us to cling on to, or maybe the message that we need to do to kind of set up where we're going next in the story and what God's going to do?
Well, this is from my perspective. I think one of the things what we just talked about, this may have been the first real encounter, that he at least acknowledges. That's at points of conversion. I think it's real critical for us to understand, and we do this all the time in our own stories. Hindsight becomes 20/20, right? So you look back and you're like, wow, his hand was on me though, like throughout my life. Like I begin to recognize this grace, and I think for Moses, we see he's one of the few characters we get throughout the Bible that we really see from birth to the end of his life.
Yeah.
And we see God's hand on him his entire life, and yet Moses doesn't recognize
No. And you see the good and the bad.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's easy for us to be critical there, but I think to Terrence's point, listen, just like Joseph did, I remember Annie Stanley saying once, Joseph did what any 17-year-old would do who knew that God was with him. Moses did what any 40-year-old would do that grew up in Pharaoh's home.
Yeah.
And so for us, I think it's really important that we begin to look throughout our lives and see, man, even in the midst of craziness, of chaos, of a lot of pain, a lot of hurt, God's hand was still right there. Like he was still right there. And that for me is really powerful, to think about.
What about you, Terrence?
Yeah, I would just say, just to kind of wrap up how this chapter ends, they're going to read some crazy stuff, about God visiting Moses at a campsite and there's a lot of unsure happenings there, but I just love how the story ends when he's reunited with this brother that apparently his mom had, and they greet each other with a kiss, and they talk about all that God has said to each other, and there's this moment of confirmation, and then we see that they walk in step together. And when they walk in step together, the people believed and worship. And I just think that's a beautiful story to say, it doesn't make you weaker or less significant that you need a little help. Moses needed help, but you don't read or hear about people talking about, I'm a disciple of Aaron. Right? They still say that they were disciples of Moses, that they followed Moses. It's like, we understand Michael Jordan to be the greatest basketball player of all time, but he needed Scottie Pippen to come alongside to help him through it. But we know that, but we still understand Jordan to be the greatest, right? And so in the same way, like your significance in faith is probably going to be better when you do it alongside other people.
Yeah.
Rarely is God going to call you to something and ask you to walk in it alone. And so, just embrace community.
Yep.
Embrace this idea of being needy to each other and watch what God does with that.
Yeah. One of the things I like in that same section, 4:18, it says that Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, this is kind of after this encounter with all the doubt, with the burning bush with God and all these things. It says, let me go back to my own people in Egypt to see if any of them are still alive. And you see that act of faith of going, I'm going to trust God and go right back to the place that I think is a place of death for me. And I'm going to step into it and see and check on my people and to do that in that expression of faith within that. I think, too, as they push forward, it's important to look at some of these imagery that plays out. The Nile comes back up again, very powerfully again. We're going to go back to there, and God's going to use that to bring redemption. Again, water is going to pop up later, where it's a barrier and then it becomes a bridge. It becomes a gateway again. And you're going to see these baptisms. You're going to see all these images come back to life where the place where they thought we are done and this is the end is going to be the place where God reveals himself, and see that time and time and time again. Guys, thank you so much for being a part of this, and we're looking forward to more.
Yeah. Thanks, man.
All right, what a great discussion. Thank you for tuning in. And I hope you learned something, because I found myself learning a ton in this discussion. Joining me is Brandon. You put this whole thing together. He wrote the Bible study, put it all together. You were listening in on our conversation. What'd you learn?
And I just think really the one big takeaway there is what we were talking about at the end, with the idea of God calling Moses and bringing him into this ministry he's prepared for him. And, we say it all the time, right, that God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called.
Yep.
And there's really that seen very clearly in Moses' life, that he doesn't really know what he's doing. He doesn't really know where he's going or what God has for him, but he knows that God has Aaron to walk alongside him. He has this community, and so he goes out on mission because he knows that God is going to meet him there.
Awesome. So this will be part of group discussion. Some of them are hopping in our groups. What are we going to talk about in our groups?
We're going to walk through some of those things about the suffering that the Israelites go to, how their slavery kind of relates to the biblical picture of sin, and how God brings us out of that on mission together.
Awesome. Guys, thank you for joining us, and we've got more stuff happening next week. We'll see you next time.